Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of South Sudan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following to participate in this meeting. Mr. Nicholas Haysom, Special Representative of the Secretary General for South Sudan and Head of the UN Mission in South Sudan. Madam Edem Wosornu, Director of Operations and Advocacy for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And Madam Jacqueline Nasiwa, Founder and Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to the report of the Secretary General on the situation in South Sudan, document S 2025-211. I now give the floor to Mr. Nicholas Haysom.
Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to brief on the situation in South Sudan, as outlined in the Secretary General's report, as submitted to this Council. Since my last briefing, there has been a sharp deterioration in the political and security situation, which threatens to unravel the peace gains made in recent years. All our efforts are now focused on preventing a relapse into widespread conflict and refocusing attention on the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. During my last update, I warned of an emerging standoff between the two preeminent parties to the agreement. This has now degenerated into direct military confrontation and escalated tensions across the country. The trigger can be traced back to events beginning in Upper Nile State since the beginning of March, when the White Army overran the Nasir-based garrison from the South Sudan People's Defense Forces. Subsequent airstrikes on Nasir, allegedly involving devices containing incendiary fuel, have caused significant casualties and horrible injuries, including to women and children. Humanitarians estimate that over 80,000 people have been displaced. The series of events in Nasir culminated on the 7th of March in an attack on a United Nations helicopter in Nasir, resulting in the death of an UNMIS crew member and numerous South Sudanese military personnel. The extraction operation during which this occurred had been conducted at the request of all parties and with assurances of safe passage from national, state and local authorities. Since then, and in the context of a deplorable downward spiral, we are receiving reports of further mobilization, respectively, of the White Army and the SSPDF in Upper Nile, allegedly including the forced recruitment of children into the respective ranks of the armed formations. The deployment of Ugandan foreign forces at the request of the South Sudanese government has further staked public anxiety. Senior SPLM-IO civilian and military actors have been removed from official posts, detained, or gone into hiding. The arrest of First Vice President Riek Machar reflects a new low in trust between the principal parties. Misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech is fueling political and ethnic tension, particularly on the social media. These conditions are darkly reminiscent of the 2013 and 2016 conflicts, which took over 400,000 lives. Dear Mr. President, this situation underscores the urgent need for a collective effort by national and international stakeholders to secure a cessation of hostilities, preserve the integrity of the revitalized agreement, and ensure necessary steps are taken to end the continuous cycles of incomplete transition. UNMIS is engaged in intensive diplomatic efforts to broker a peaceful solution alongside many stakeholders, including, but not limited to, the African Union Peace and Security Council, its panel of the WISE, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, His Holiness Pope Francis, the United Nations Secretary General, and this Council itself. The message from peace partners is clear and consistent. The parties must resolve tensions through dialogue, build trust and confidence, refocus on the peace agreement and consensus-based decision-making, and assure the people of their steadfast commitment not to return to war. We need look no further than across the northern border to Sudan for a stark reminder of how quickly a country can descend into catastrophic conflict. The region cannot afford another crisis that could further destabilize an already fragile landscape. To avoid this outcome, I must underscore the critical role of neighboring states as guarantors of the agreement in restoring peace and stability in South Sudan. With this in mind, I seek the support of the Council to, firstly, immediately address the Nasser tensions through dialogue rather than further military confrontation, which risks tipping the country into a broader conflict. The situation in Nasser is above all the result of political deadlocks and disagreements that have escalated into violent clashes. Secondly, echo the recent communique of the African Union Peace and Security Council and the IGAD Extraordinary Summit by urging all parties to adhere to the ceasefire and the peace agreement, including reinvigorating the functioning of its relevant mechanisms. Thirdly, call for the release of detained military and civilian officials or their treatment in accordance with legal process. Lastly, encourage the two principals to exercise restraint, address their differences constructively and through public dialogue, and manifestly put the interests of the people first. To help secure these outcomes, UNMIS is committed to leaving no stone unturned. Mr. President, South Sudan faces one of the worst humanitarian outlooks since independence. Driven by escalating subnational violence, the spillover from the Sudan conflict, deepening economic collapse, extreme weather, and a sharp decline in international aid, regional volatility is also fueling instability in South Sudan. Around 9.3 million people, 3/4 of the population, need assistance, and 7.7 million are suffering acute food insecurity. A cholera outbreak continues amid a crippled health system with 47,000 cases and 877 deaths so far. Humanitarians are doing all they can to stretch scarce resources to also support 1.1 million returnees and refugees who have fled the war in Sudan. But funding cuts are dismantling life-saving services. Let me underscore, there are no quick fixes to this crisis, and there is a need for strategic alignment between peace-building, humanitarian, and development efforts, particularly around food security, climate resilience, basic services, and governance. In this volatile environment, and as emphasized in the Secretary-General's report, the protection of civilians, in particular women and children, must be a priority. While it is the primary responsibility of the government of South Sudan to protect its civilians, the rapidly evolving situation underlying UNMIS's protection of civilians mandate is more important than ever. UNMIS is increasing its protection of civilians measures, including reinforcing our posture at IDP sites in Juba, which are locations of particular risk. UNMIS force has responded proactively to the situation by increasing its patrols and enhancing security at its bases, with the quick reaction forces on standby to address unexpected situations. These measures underscore the mission's preparedness to face deteriorating conditions and its important role in protecting civilians. This is in the context of our overarching protection of civilian strategy, which is based on projecting our physical presence to areas of priority need, flexible basing arrangements and robust troop deployments, enhanced patrolling and procuring capabilities, as well as equipment that are fit for purpose in the climate-affected terrain in which we operate. All of these efforts are being carried out in close coordination and through enhanced engagement with the national authorities to ensure a shared approach to civilian protection and conflict mitigation. These efforts complement our longer-term protection and political strategy, which is to foster a protective environment that supports South Sudanese in conducting their own political and societal transformation through the completion of the nation's long-promised democratic transition. This requires nurturing the essential enabling conditions and democratic environment, such as the civic and political space, and strengthening the rule of law, which will endure beyond a single electoral event. It is precisely because these conditions are grounded in universal principles, rights, and fundamental institutions that they will prevail long after we as a mission leave South Sudan. It is in this context that I note the recent launch of the civic education campaign and public consultations on the Constitution. This marks the beginning of the constitution-making process. I must note that UNMIS faces operational limitations in all these tasks, especially in the face of this broader conflict. Our peacekeepers continue to face access denials on the ground. If the current trend continues, we are looking at a shift in conflict dynamics from subnational and community-based violence to a more complex picture involving signatory parties and foreign actors. We are already prioritizing resources accordingly, but UNMIS is a peacekeeping mission, not an army, and cannot be everywhere all at once. In this context, the 4 pillars of UNMIS mandate remain as important as ever. This includes protection of civilians, facilitating the delivery of humanitarian assistance, supporting the implementation of the peace agreement, and monitoring and reporting on human rights. We seek the support of this Council to ensure mandate continuity during the crisis. South Sudan has asked for comprehensive electoral assistance from the United Nations. We are positioning ourselves as one UN to support all phases of the electoral cycle. However, this task is made difficult without a level of serious commitment, decision-making, and action from the country's political leadership. Meanwhile, discussions continue with our host government on the status of the UNMIS Tonping base. Despite receiving an initial ultimatum to vacate the site, our approach has been to conduct a constructive negotiation towards a phased relocation that maintains the mission's critical functions at the site. We welcome the opportunity to continue our engagement with the government on that basis, readily making available land and facilities as these become available and free for transfer. Excellencies, let me underscore once again that there is a serious and growing risk that conflict dynamics may steer South Sudan dangerously off track. The revitalized peace agreement remains the only viable framework to break this cycle of violence in South Sudan. The overriding imperative now is to urgently avert a relapse into full-scale conflict, refocus efforts on accelerating the implementation of the agreement, and advance the transition towards South Sudan's first democratic elections. Another war is a risk South Sudan simply cannot afford, and nor can the wider region. I thank this Council for its continued support. Thank you.
I thank the Special Representative, Mr. Haysom, for his valuable briefing, both specific in terms of the forecast and with proposals included. And I will give the floor to Madam Edem Wasornu, Director of Operations and Advocacy for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Mr. President, when I last briefed this Council on South Sudan in August 2024, I warned of a perfect storm of stressors with humanitarian, economic, political, security, environmental crises unfolding simultaneously. The regional volatility is also deepening, as you heard in the close consultations on Sudan yesterday. 8 months on, and as the SRSG has described, the situation has deteriorated dramatically into what the Secretary General recently described as a humanitarian nightmare. If the political crisis is not averted, the humanitarian nightmare will become a reality very quickly. Today, allow me to focus on 3 critical issues: the rapidly escalating violence and its impact on the humanitarian system, the compounding effects of pre-existing crises, and the challenging operating environment and funding constraints. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, this year, 9.3 million South Sudanese, 3/4 of the population, requires some form of humanitarian assistance. Children make the half of it. The violence has also swept through Upper Nile State from mid-February, has escalated tensions nationwide, with armed clashes and aerial bombardments causing dozens of casualties. About 130,000 people have been newly displaced, including many thousands reported to have crossed into Ethiopia. This rising violence and displacement have increased the exposure, of course, as always, of women and girls to gender-based violence, including sexual violence and exploitation. During her recent visit to Malakal, Upper Nile, in fact yesterday, Kiki Gbeho, the humanitarian coordinator, heard firsthand accounts of the impact of the violence and what it's having on people. 6 health facilities have been forced to shut down to attacks and destruction. Earlier this week, services at Ulang Hospital in Upper Nile, a lifeline for 174,000 people, were suspended following extensive looting. In addition to the civilian casualties, the violence has claimed the lives of 4 humanitarian workers, bringing the total this year to 5. Humanitarian access remains severely restricted to reach those in need, and critical medical supplies are rapidly running out amid an ongoing cholera outbreak. Again, you heard from SRSG, Haysom. In the capital, Juba, about 9,600 people are reported to have moved into displacement camps in search of safety and protection. Mr. President, last week, the World Food Programme warned that vulnerable families in the northeast of the country are at a critical tipping point, with hunger nearing record levels. With the pre-harvest lean season now beginning, almost 7.7 million people acutely hungry, up from 7.1 million people in the same period in 2024. Beyond the current violence, market disruption, high inflation, and reduced purchasing power also continue to limit household access to food. Our assessments project that 650,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of severe acute malnutrition this year. A reduction in nutrition services, along with spreading violence and mounting displacement, are likely to deepen food insecurity and malnutrition in the coming months, especially for women and children. Humanitarian access in South Sudan continues to face significant challenges due to insecurity, bureaucratic impediments, physical constraints, and complex political dynamics. The damage and looting of humanitarian facilities and the risks of violence complicate movements into hard-to-reach communities caught up in the conflict. More than 100 access-related incidents were reported since the beginning of the year, similar to the same time last year. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, the conflict in Sudan, now in its third year, continues to have a profound impact on South Sudan. 2 years since the conflict broke, April 2023, over 1.1 million refugees and returnees have crossed the border. This unprecedented influx has placed immense pressure on local services, food supplies, and already fragile infrastructure, particularly in border areas such as Renk, Malakal, Awil. We are particularly concerned about the impact on refugee women and girls who face heightened risks, always, of sexual violence and reproductive health complications. We are also concerned about the growing ethnic divisions and tensions with overstretched host communities. Competition over limited resources is likely to fuel further instability, exacerbate local grievances, and increase the threat of intercommunal violence, putting humanitarian workers at risk. The conflict in Sudan is also contributing to an economic crisis in South Sudan, impacting trade, causing inflation to soar to 180%, and reducing state oil revenues. Despite ongoing response efforts, the cholera outbreak first identified in Renk County, near the border with Sudan, has continued to spread. The outbreak, the worst in the nation's history, has infected 49,000 people, claimed the lives of over 900 people. Health partners have rolled out countryside vaccination campaigns that have reached 5.2 million people so far. But the risk will grow as the rainy season begins. Last year, severe flooding affected around 1.4 million people across the country. More broadly, the climate crisis continues to drive displacement, disrupt food production, and escalate competition over scarce resources, fueling localized violence. Mr. President, in the face of huge challenges, the humanitarian community continues to deliver. By the end of February, about 1.3 million people had been reached with some form of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian aid alone cannot resolve political crises, but this year, our ability to even mitigate the effects of is being severely undermined by unprecedented funding cuts. Our scarce resources are already overstretched. With a very worrying outlook, the window of opportunity must be seized to avert a humanitarian nightmare with a relapse of widespread conflict. This demands urgent, concerted, decisive action on multiple fronts by national and international stakeholders. Let me end with 3 asks. First, immediate and sustained action to prevent a further deterioration of the situation, including securing an immediate cessation of hostilities. This requires our collective efforts to keep the country from descending into chaos and conflict spilling over into neighboring countries. Second, all parties need to recommit to dialogue to resolve their differences and fully adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. Civilians must be protected from all forms of violence, including indiscriminate and ethnically motivated attacks. The safety and security of humanitarian workers and assets also needs to be safeguarded. And third, without immediate and flexible funding, we will be unable to sustain and deliver up to scale what is required in the humanitarian response. We will not be able to deliver a commensurate response with the high levels of need. The 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan requires $1.7 billion to support close to 5.4 million people. This is the reprioritized number that we need. We remain grateful to our donors for their generosity. The people of South Sudan are counting on your support. Lives are at stake. I thank you.
Je remercie Madame la
I thank Ms. Wazornu for her briefing and for her requests to the Council. I now give the floor to Ms. Jacqueline Nasiwa.
This opportunity to brief the Security Council on the situation of South Sudan, where escalating violence threatens a relapse into a civil war. I am Jacqueline Nasiwa, the founder and executive director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice, an organization advancing human rights, justice, women's empowerment, and civic engagement in South Sudan. My briefing today will focus on the urgency of finding a political solution to the persistent conflict in South Sudan, shrinking political and civic space, the important role of UNMIS. South Sudan is confronting a political crisis that is tearing the country apart. It is also putting the lives of civilians at risk, including through indiscriminate aerial bombardment. This crisis is jeopardizing everything we hope to gain during the transitional period, such as justice, judicial reform, a citizen-driven constitution-making process, security sector reform, and preparations towards democratic elections in 2026. The people of South Sudan can no longer wait to vote for leaders who are accountable to them. The current conflict is exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation, widespread food insecurity and displacement. It has also had a devastating impact on women and girls. According to UNMIS reports, 65% of women and girls in South Sudan face some form of gender-based violence during their lifetime, one of the highest in the region. Through our work with survivors of sexual violence in Juba, Bentiu, Mundri, and Bor, and at the protection of civilian camps, my organization has witnessed firsthand the stigma affecting survivors who desperately need life-saving services such as sexual and reproductive health and psychosocial care, recognition and support to children born as a result of conflict-related sexual violence. Excellencies, the people of South Sudan are tired and traumatized and cannot heal in an environment of unending violence and political uncertainty. The immediate needs on the ground are for civilian protection and unobstructed aid delivery. While I commend the recent efforts by UNMIS to increase safety measures around the POC site in Juba, these efforts should be expanded to areas such as Nasir, Malakal, and Rueng, among others, who are also in their need. Civil society and survivors have also time and again called for accountability, nationwide disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, training and professionalization of the National Army on human rights and protection of civilians as essential to breaking the cycle of violence and ending impunity in South Sudan. In addition, humanitarian workers who face violence and bureaucratic impediments must be allowed to safely reach those in need, especially women, children, and the elderly. International community and UNMIS must prioritize an immediate ceasefire and long-term peace. Despite its slow implementation, the revitalized agreement remains the only viable option for the people of South Sudan to transition to democracy. Yet today, it is on the brink of collapse. As civil society, we urge the Council to pressure the parties to jointly declare an immediate cessation of hostility and recommit themselves to the revitalized agreement. In addition, I strongly recommend that the Security Council call for a resumption of the Tumaine Peace Initiative, which would not only bring in holdout groups that did not sign the revitalized agreement, but also provide an opportunity to address the challenges of nation building. And finally, it is also critical that the international community urgently support grassroots peace building and devise mechanisms for early warning and atrocity prevention to de-escalate violence. The current crisis has further eroded the already shrinking civic and political space with arbitrary arrests and detentions of politicians and journalists without due process of the law. This has restricted civic engagement, weakened democratic processes, and undercut regional efforts by IGAD, the AU, the Troika, and the European Union to de-escalate the current crisis, enhance mediation efforts to dialogue, and support the full implementation of the revitalized agreement. Such an environment denies their rights to fundamental freedom of expression, assembly, association, and access to information, and puts the lives of human rights defenders at risk in South Sudan and the region. For a young democracy like South Sudan, dissent must be tolerated to foster a culture of dialogue and transparency, and inculcate core values of respect for human rights. I therefore urge the Security Council to call for the release of all political detainees and opening up civic and political space. All parties must ensure an environment that is conducive for safe, peaceful, and democratic elections. Any political and peace processes must be inclusive of women, faith-based leaders, and civil society. While the percentage of women in the presidency has increased to 40% with the recent appointment of a second female vice president, generally there has been a lack of adherence to the 35% quota for women's participation. Regrettably, the National Electoral Commission, for example, comprises only 2 women out of 9 commissioners, and 0 women at the state high committees. UNMIS should deploy experts and intensify support to the transitional governance institutions and civil society to fast-track women's participation beyond the 35% quota at all levels of government. Finally, as this Council deliberates on UNMIS mandate renewal, I must underline how essential the UN is for South Sudan at this particular moment. UNMIS can play an important role in de-escalating the current crisis and preventing violence, protecting civilians, including against gender-based violence, monitoring violations of international humanitarian and human rights law to ensure South Sudan meets its international obligations. UNMIS should increase efforts to better support peaceful, free, and fair elections, assist parties in executing key benchmarks for a process to draft a permanent constitution and create conditions for the protection of civic and political space. Further, given the risk to women and girls I have described in my statement today, it is essential to prioritize gender across implementation of UNMIS mandate. I urge all Council members to work together to preserve and renew this mandate in full at this perilous moment for my people. Excellencies, the people of South Sudan cannot afford another senseless and destructive war, nor any form of a politically motivated communal violence. We as women, human rights group, and civil society remain committed in our pursuit for a lasting peace. Today, we need your support more than ever. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank Ms. Nasiwa, Founder and Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice, for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
President, and thank you, SRSG Nicholas Haysom, Director Idam Wosornu, and Ms. Jacqueline Nasiwa for your informative briefings today. We do appreciate your insights. Mr. President, the United States is alarmed by the deteriorating security situation in South Sudan. The spread and intensification of conflict between the South Sudanese People's Defense Forces and opposition forces are deeply concerning. With the arrests of First Vice President Machar and senior SPLM-IO officials, the entire peace process appears to be collapsing. The impact of this conflict on the people of South Sudan is especially worrying. We are deeply troubled by reports of ground attacks, aerial bombardments, and indiscriminate use of barrel bombs that have killed many civilians and displaced tens of thousands. All sides must abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those relating to the protection of civilians. Escalating political divisions in South Sudan threaten to bring the country back to broader conflict. Mr. President, we echo recent statements from the AU and IGAD calling for maximum restraint, prioritization of dialogue, and the need to resolve differences through peaceful means. We urge all members here today to condemn the ongoing violence and to put strong pressure on South Sudan's leaders to cease violence, de-escalate political tensions, engage in dialogue, and recommit to fully implementing the peace agreement. We commend the tireless efforts of UNMIS to support peace and stability in South Sudan, and we express our gratitude to UNMIS personnel as they work to implement their mandate in these difficult circumstances. Colleagues, the Council and UNMIS can only do so much without political will from the transitional government of South Sudan. The transitional government appears convinced that it can perpetually extend its existence while failing to implement key aspects of the peace agreement and failing to use public revenue to address public needs. These failures continue to fuel conflict and insecurity. While political and business elites profit from South Sudan's resources, 92% of the population live in extreme poverty, and millions are experiencing acute food insecurity. In addition, the transitional government has not paid civil servants and security forces for nearly 15 months. In the past 3 months, the Secretary General reports nearly 400 incidents of movement restrictions imposed on UNMIS by the transitional government. The transitional government has continued with its unacceptable request that UNMIS vacate their Tomping headquarters, which is critical for mission operations. The intensification of violence in South Sudan is deeply concerning, threatening to return the country to widespread conflict and worsening humanitarian crisis. Mr. President, the peace process only remains viable with the full commitment of all parties, and we are deeply troubled by actions that jeopardize the peace process. Now, more than ever, we must call on the transitional government to ensure that UNMIS has the ability to carry out its mandate without hindrance for the benefit of the people of South Sudan. We look forward to working with fellow council members to ensure UNMIS is supported by the transitional government, and we implore our fellow council members to continue pressing South Sudan's leaders for a peaceful solution to the ongoing conflict. I thank you.
Je remercie Madame la
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+ members, namely Algeria, Guyana, Somalia, and my country, Sierra Leone. We thank Mr. Nicholas Haysom, Special Representative of the Secretary General for South Sudan and Head of the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, and Ms. Idem Wosono, Director of Operations and Advocacy of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, for their important and timely briefings. We also take note of the valuable contribution of Ms. Jacqueline Nasiwa, Founder and Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice. We welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan in today's meeting. Mr. President, the A3+ expresses deep concern over the recent developments that have led to the deterioration of the political and security situation in South Sudan. The reported fractures within the National Unity Government, including the detention of senior officials such as the First Vice President and cabinet ministers, risk undermining the conducive environment necessary for sustaining peace. We urge the South Sudanese authorities and relevant stakeholders to place the interest of the people above all else and to prioritize the consolidation of the hard-won gains, anchored in national cohesion and trust, as envisaged in the 2018 Revitalized Agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. Recognizing the importance of collective responsibility, we encourage the leadership of South Sudan to engage in inclusive and direct political dialogue to resolve their differences. It is imperative that all actions be taken in line with the provisions of the Revitalized Peace Agreement to preserve the political and security stability that had been achieved. We call on all parties to refrain from acts that could undermine the agreement and to take urgent steps to ensure the protection of civilians. We commend the critical role of UNMIS in supporting these efforts. The A3+ underscores the importance of regional initiatives in de-escalating tensions and promoting durable peace in South Sudan. In this regard, we affirm our support for the continued engagement of the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in facilitating dialogue among the parties to the Revitalized Peace Agreement and other key stakeholders. We welcome the efforts of the AU, including the recent visit of the AU Panel of the Wise to South Sudan, aimed at fostering national dialogue. We urge the authorities to ensure meaningful engagement with the regional actors and to leverage these efforts for a peaceful resolution. We also call on neighboring countries and other actors with influence to act constructively in support of the peace process and refrain from any actions that may further exacerbate tensions. Mr. President, the A3+ strongly condemns the attack on UN helicopters during an evacuation mission on 7th March, which tragically resulted in the death of one UN crew member and serious injuries to 2 others, along with the killing of 28 South Sudanese People's Defense Forces soldiers, including a general. We urge the revitalized transitional government of national unity to conduct a swift, credible, and transparent investigation into the incident and ensure accountability. Attacks against UN personnel may constitute war crimes and must not go unpunished. We remind all parties of their obligations under international law to protect civilians. Reports of aerial bombardments in densely populated areas constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law and breach the permanent ceasefire provisions of the Revitalized Peace Agreement. Such actions are detrimental to the peace process and must cease immediately. The A3+ remains gravely concerned about continuing reports of conflict-related sexual violence, including against children, intercommunal violence, and the recruitment of child soldiers by various armed groups. We call on the government of South Sudan to strengthen the national legal framework and allocate adequate resources to enhance the capacity of the judiciary and law enforcement to prosecute such crimes. We call for international support for these efforts. Mr. President, South Sudan stands at a critical juncture in its journey as an independent nation. The leadership must ensure that the revitalized electoral roadmap towards elections in December 2026 remains on course. This milestone can only be reached if bold political choices are made and the necessary political will and resources are committed to supporting the institutions responsible for delivering credible elections. In this regard, the A3+ welcomes the AU Commission's effort to prioritize electoral support to the AU Peace Fund. We further appeal to the international community and the member states to mobilize the resources required to facilitate credible, transparent, and inclusive elections in 2026. This includes enabling civic space, supporting constitutional census processes, and strengthening cooperation with UNMIS to ensure effective implementation. We urge the leadership of South Sudan to take urgent steps to build trust and confidence among all stakeholders and expedite the deployment of the necessary unified forces. This is essential for sustaining momentum in the political process, particularly in advancing the electoral roadmap. The people of South Sudan have endured immense suffering, and we must ensure that their calls for peace, unity, and democratic participation are met with action and resolve. I thank you.
Je remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the permanent representative of Sierra Leone. I now give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. I thank SRSG Haysom, Director Wasonu, and Ms. Naziwa for their sobering remarks today, and I welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan at our meeting. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK is deeply concerned at recent political tensions and increased fighting across South Sudan between parties to the 2018 peace agreement and other opposition forces. This includes the ongoing conflict in Upper Nile State. We were appalled by the attack on a UN helicopter in Nasir, which resulted in the death of an UNMIS contractor. The current escalation risks South Sudan's hard-won peace. A return to widespread conflict would devastate the country and have damaging consequences for the broader region, especially in the context of the ongoing crisis in Sudan. The escalation of violence in Upper Nile State has already caused dozens of civilian casualties and displaced at least 120,000 people. So we urge the parties to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to civilian populations in Nasir and Ulang who are in need of emergency assistance and protection. Second, we are concerned by the arrest and ongoing detention of First Vice President Machar. This action undermines the core principles of the 2018 peace agreement. Alongside the AU and other international partners, we call for this action to be reversed to enable both parties to return to dialogue. We welcome efforts by regional partners, including the AU and IGAD, to work with the South Sudanese leadership to de-escalate tensions. And we call on South Sudan's collective leadership to cease hostilities, release political detainees, including First Vice President Machar, and to engage seriously with regional mediation efforts. Third, President, the recent instability is a reminder of the importance of UNMIS as a peace partner for South Sudan. The UK commends UNMIS's work to de-escalate tension and protect civilians. In this challenging context, their work to monitor human rights violations and support the provision of humanitarian assistance is critical. And we call on South Sudanese leadership to ensure the mission has freedom of movement without political interference so that it can effectively carry out its mandate from this Council. I thank you.
Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of UNMIS, Mr. Nicholas Haysom, as well as Ms. Wosornu, Director OCHA, and Ms. Nasiva for their briefings and valuable insights. The Secretary General's recent report on the situation in South Sudan and the briefings we just heard highlight the risk of reversal of the gains made under the revitalized peace agreement over the past 7 years. In the last meeting on South Sudan, held on 5th February, the discussions were focused on how to consolidate the gains and move forward towards elections. Unfortunately, in less than 2 months, the discourse has shifted. The situation has worsened. We share the concerns about possible further deterioration in the political and the security situation in South Sudan, and hence the need to de-escalate and address the underlying cause of this downward slide. I wish to make the following points for addressing the current crisis. First, the house arrest of First Vice President Riek Machar and other senior SPLM-IO officials has undermined the peace process. We support the demand of African Union and others for the immediate and unconditional release of Mr. Machar and detained opposition figures to restore trust in the political process. The revitalized peace agreement should be fully implemented without delay. Second, we urge the parties to engage in direct dialogue for the benefit of the people of South Sudan. We support inclusive dialogue between the government and the opposition. We commend the efforts made by SRSG Haysom in helping to de-escalate the situation and call on the parties to engage in good faith with him and with the regional mediation efforts, particularly by the African Union, the AU High-Level Ad Hoc Committee for South Sudan, C5, and IGAD. Third, the humanitarian crisis is being compounded by the rise in political tensions. 9.3 million people, 3/4 of the population, need assistance, and 7.7 million are suffering acute food insecurity. The 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan is only 10.5% resourced. The funding gap must be urgently met to prevent famine and disease outbreaks. The bravery and commitment of humanitarian workers operating under challenging circumstances in South Sudan deserve our full appreciation and support. Lastly, UNMIS remains a force of stability. We greatly appreciate the sacrifices and efforts of the UNMIS peacekeepers aimed at consolidating peace and development in South Sudan under challenging circumstances. On 7th March, in a rescue attempt of government forces in Upper Nile region, an UNMIS helicopter was shot at, with one crew member losing his life. Attack on peacekeepers amount to war crimes, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Mr. President, UNMIS has been instrumental in reducing community violence through its patrolling. In a single month, March 2025, UNMIS has conducted 8,551 patrols by land, air, and river to protect civilians, deter conflict, and ensure the safe delivery of humanitarian aid as well as logistical supplies to UNMIS bases. UNMIS engineering contingents are rehabilitating thousands of kilometers of roads and other critical infrastructure to support safe communication, travel, trade, and peace building. Peacekeeping engineers from Pakistan have built and are maintaining 80 kilometers of dikes in Bentiu, protecting 300,000 people stranded on a tiny sliver of land surrounded by 5,400 kilometers of floodwaters. Keeping in view the crucial tasks being performed by UNMIS, we encourage the South Sudanese government to cooperate fully with the mission in the performance of its mandate and meeting its operational needs. In this regard, the issue of Tomping Base must also be resolved amicably. Mr. President, UNMIS is currently operating with 3,000 troops less than its sanctioned strength. The military assessment has been clear that the mission needs those troops to perform its mandate effectively. Keeping in view the deteriorating situation on the ground, UNMIS must be adequately strengthened and reinforced to face the new realities on the ground. I thank you very much.
Je remercie, Monsieur le
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama. Thank you, President. I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, Mr. Nicholas Haysom, for his leadership of the United Nations mission in South Sudan. And I'd also like to thank the staff who continue to implement the mission's mandate with dedication and commitment, in spite of the extremely complex circumstances. We're also grateful to Ms. Wosornu and Ms. Nasiwa for their important and detailed briefings. And we acknowledge the presence of the Permanent Representative of South Sudan here this morning. Panama remains concerned by the recent events in South Sudan, particularly the deterioration of the security situation and the uptick in political tensions. In line with what has been mentioned in the briefings this morning, we recognize the importance of diplomatic initiatives from regional stakeholders to contain the conflict, particularly given the risks that there could be spillover to the wider region. Panama therefore welcomes the efforts recognized and mentioned in the recent communication from the African Union Peace and Security Council meeting held on the 18th of March on the situation in South Sudan. We hope these initiatives will lead to specific results to consolidate political dialogue and the peace process. However, we are alarmed by the recent uptick in the conflict between the People's Defense Forces of South Sudan and the opposition groups in various parts of the country, particularly in the wake of the arbitrary detention of the First Vice President Machar and high officials. This represents a significant threat to the revitalized peace agreement and the democratic transition. We urge all parties to stick to the cessation of hostilities agreement and to fulfill it comprehensively and without delay. We are also concerned by the increasing impact of the conflict on civilians. We condemn in the strongest possible terms violence against civilians, particularly the incidence of sexual violence related to the conflict against women and children. This is a serious violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Panama urgently calls on the authorities to look into these crimes to guarantee accountability and immediately to adopt measures to protect people. We are deeply concerned by the more than 100 serious violations against minors which were verified by the UN in 2024, particularly the recruitment of more than 50 children. In addition to this, the appearance of unidentified armed groups responsible for these violations represents an alarming challenge. The humanitarian and economic context remains critical, with more than 6 million people suffering from acute food insecurity. This is added to the effects of the conflict in Sudan, as well as climate shocks and the serious cholera outbreak, which has affected some 49,000 people. We also take note of the finalization of the electoral calendar by the National Electoral Commission for there to be elections scheduled for December 2026. However, we are concerned about the delays in the civic education campaign and the process of public consultations, which are key parts of the constitutional drafting process. President, we urge the parties to redouble their efforts to make headway in implementing the outstanding provisions of the revitalized agreement, as has been pointed out also by the African Union, as well as the Intergovernmental Development Authority and UNMIS at the beginning of this year. We reiterate our commitment to sustainable peace in South Sudan and multilateral efforts geared towards finding an inclusive political solution, fully respecting human rights and international law. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Panama. I now give the floor to Greece.
Monsieur le Président, je vous
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for having convened this meeting on South Sudan. I also wish to voice our gratitude to the Special Representative, Mr. Haysom, for his valuable briefing, as well as the Director of OCHA, Madam Wosurnu, and the Civil Society Representative, Madam Nashiwa. Mr. President, we applaud the dedication of UNMIS personnel as they continue to deliver upon the mandate despite significant political, security, and humanitarian challenges. As the Security Council prepares to renew UNMIS's mandate later this month, we must see to it that the mission has the necessary means at its disposal to address developments of the situation on the ground. At this juncture, I wish to set out three observations. Firstly, at the political level, South Sudan once again finds itself at a crossroads. Despite the commitments that have been set out in the revitalized agreement, the recent surges of violence, specifically in Nasir region, and the use of aerial bombardment against civilians have severely undermined trust in the peace process. Greece firmly condemns the tragic loss of United Nations personnel during a recent evacuation, as well as the recurrent restrictions repeatedly imposed on freedom of movement for blue helmets. This illustrates growing threats weighing on humanitarian and UN personnel. All responsible parties must address these violations of international humanitarian law. Turning to the planned closure of Tumping Base, a vital logistics and operational center for UNMIS in Juba, a realistic, practical, and economically viable solution needs to be arrived at. We are also equally concerned by indications of growing political polarization, the detention of key figures of the SPLMIO, the suspension of opposition participation in transition mechanisms, and the deployment of foreign military forces to compromise not only the revitalized agreement, but also South Sudanese territorial integrity and sovereignty, as well as regional stability. Second, amid this fragile context, the Women, Peace, Security agenda needs to remain a paramount priority and needs to be reflected in UNMIS's mandate renewal. South Sudanese women and girls continue to suffer disproportionately as a consequence of conflict-related sexual violence. We condemn strongly this violence. Perpetrators must be held accountable, and appropriate support needs to be provided to victims. We are also very much alarmed by the ongoing recruitment and use of children in armed conflict. The verification of more than 100 grave violations against children in 2024 underscores the urgent need to implement the 2020 Comprehensive Plan of Action and to end and prevent grave violations against them. Third, the humanitarian situation remains critical. More than 9 million people need humanitarian assistance, including refugees fleeing the conflict in neighboring Sudan. Violence against humanitarian personnel, displaced civilians, as well as vital infrastructure is unacceptable and must end immediately. To conclude, Mr. President, Greece reaffirms its unstinting support to peace, accountability, and inclusive governance in South Sudan. We reiterate our robust commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of South Sudan. We stand in solidarity with their people, and we reaffirm our unwavering support to their aspirations towards peace, security, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Je remercie, Monsieur le
I thank the Permanent Representative of Greece for a statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, and let me also thank SRG Haysom, Director Wosurnu, and Ms. Nasiva for their briefings. I also welcome the Permanent Representative of South Sudan to the Chamber. What we've heard today and recent developments in South Sudan have been nothing short of alarming. Reports of brutal violence against civilians and the looming risk of a return to civil war are extremely concerning. Denmark urges all the actors to immediately cease their armed operations and put the people of South Sudan first. Mr. President, I'll focus on 4 key points. First, the 1918 Revitalized Peace Agreement remains the most viable path forward, and all parties must recommit to it. This agreement was crafted to provide guidance towards lasting peace. It established mechanisms to resolve political differences and hold the perpetrators of past crimes accountable. Now is the time to recommit to these mechanisms, not to turn away from them. As we've heard today, the collapse of this agreement could have had catastrophic consequences. The leaders of both sides have a responsibility to do all in their powers to avoid that. The arrest of First Vice President Machar does not foster an atmosphere conducive to dialogue and peace. We urge President Kiir to reverse this decision. Likewise, the continued violation of the arms embargoes must be stopped, along with other means of external military engagement, which is fueling the conflict. Second, Mr. President, mediation efforts by regional organizations and regional leaders at the highest level are essential. These are not distant observers, but trusted and credible partners. As others, Denmark fully supports the African Union and IGAD in their outreach and mediation effort, and we strongly urge the parties to engage. The African Union delegation, led by the panel of the wise, is a commendable initiative. We call on South Sudanese leaders to allow this delegation to conduct its mediation efforts free from interference. The panel must have the opportunity to consult with all parties. Third, Mr. President, alongside regional leadership, we recognize the indispensable role played by UNMIS. We are alarmed by recent attacks on UNMIS personnel and assets and call for full accountability for those responsible. We note the increase in SOFA violations and call on the government of South Sudan to fully comply with the Status of Forces Agreement. In these challenging circumstances, from renewed clashes to the adverse impacts of climate change, the Council has a responsibility to ensure UNMIS can fulfill its mandate effectively. That includes through robust presence and adequate resources. The mission must be able to protect civilians, including women, youth, and children, who are especially vulnerable in fragile contexts. It must also be able to support the safe and meaningful participation of women in the peace process. And it must be enabled to support efforts to combat impunity, to promote accountability for violations of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights, including sexual and gender-based violence. Fourth, Mr. President, this violence is taking place against the backdrop of an already dire humanitarian situation with millions displaced as a result. As the OCHA director highlighted, it has also exacerbated a widespread cholera outbreak and caused acute food insecurity, pushing communities to the brink. In addition, South Sudan remains extremely dangerous for aid workers. We call on all actors to uphold international humanitarian and human rights law. This is particularly urgent amid diminishing donor funding. In conclusion, Mr. President, we cannot allow the world's youngest nation and its people to endure the horrors of war once again. Denmark stands ready to continue its support to UNMIS and the people of South Sudan. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the permanent representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Mr. President, I thank SRG Haysom, Director Osorno, and Ms. Nasiva for the sobering briefings. I also welcome the representative of South Sudan to the meeting. Mr. President, escalating violence and tensions which are threatening and undermining the fragile gains of the revitalized peace agreement, leading to possible statewide conflict, are deepening our concern for the world's youngest state and its people. Let me address 3 points. Firstly, there is an urgent need for de-escalation and stabilization in South Sudan. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, engage in dialogue, and work collectively to preserve and build on the gains achieved through the peace agreement. We are horrified by the impact of the armed clashes on the civilian population, particularly aerial bombardments. We strongly condemn these actions and remind all, including all external actors, of their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. Civilians must never be targeted. On the contrary, civilians must be protected. Mr. President, we commend the engagement by the African Union, IGAD, and countries in the region and encourage their continued efforts. We urge all parties in South Sudan to recommit to the cessation of hostilities agreement and the revitalized agreement and to resolve political differences through the established mechanisms. We call on all parties to uphold their commitments, release political detainees, including First Vice President Machar, and return to direct and inclusive dialogue. Secondly, we strongly condemn the attack on UNMIS's helicopter on March 7th, which claimed several lives, including UN personnel. We extend our condolences to the victims' families and reiterate that attack on peacekeepers may constitute a war crime, and those responsible must be held accountable. As we approach the renewal of the mission's mandate, Slovenia reaffirms its support for UNMIS and its vital role in protecting civilians, advancing peace, promoting and assisting in full, safe, meaningful and effective participation of women, youth and civil society in peace process and transitional governance structures, fostering community cohesion and enhancing local capacity for resilience. In this context, we commend SRSG Haysom de-escalation efforts. However, we remain alarmed by the ongoing violations of the Status of Forces Agreement and urge the government to fully respect and implement its provisions. UNMIS's robust mandate remains critical. Thirdly, we're deeply concerned about the impact of what Secretary General described as, I quote, dark clouds of a perfect storm, unquote, on civilians. There is no shortage of challenges in South Sudan, from climate shocks and prolonged spillover from the conflict in Sudan to intercommunal violence, additional large-scale displacements, and ongoing human rights violations and abuses, including alarming levels of sexual and gender-based violence. The country is now experiencing unprecedented food insecurity, the worst since its independence. As the conflict escalates and hunger worsens, women and children once again bear the brunt of the crisis, while humanitarian efforts remain hampered. The ongoing crisis is exacerbating an already fragile humanitarian environment. We call on all parties to ensure safety and security of civilians and humanitarian workers, and to enable safe, unhindered humanitarian access. Mr. President, in conclusion, South Sudan, still healing from a devastating civil war that claimed over 400,000 lives, stands at another critical juncture. We reiterate our call on all parties to engage in good faith and through dialogue to ensure that history does not repeat itself. I thank you.
Madame la représentante.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Mr. President, we express our gratitude to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Nicholas Haysom, the Director of OCHA, of Operations and Advocacy, Madam Era Wasorno, as well as the representative of South Sudanese Civil Society, Madam Jacqueline Nasiwa, for the information that they have shared with us. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the Permanent Representative of South Sudan. We are concerned by the escalating situation in the Republic of South Sudan, episodes with the resumed hostilities between supporters of the opposition and government troops, as well as human casualties, including civilian victims. We trust that the parties to the South Sudanese political process will manage to promptly reach agreement and halt the armed confrontation, that they will demonstrate political will with a view to ensure full compliance with the provisions of the revitalized peace agreement to resolve the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, and that they will undertake the necessary efforts to ensure stringent compliance with the new timeline for the transitional period. An important component of the process is the constitution of unified armed forces as the guarantor for advancement of the peace process. We proceed from the following premise: the situation in South Sudan is under the control of the current government. President Salva Kiir has delivered the relevant statement with assurances that he will not allow for the country to slide into the abyss of renewed civil war. Along the same lines, steps are being undertaken by Juba to bolster security in the capital. We believe that the common objective of the Security Council is to support the authorities' efforts towards stabilization rather than stoking unnecessary tensions. It is important for further steps to find common ground between the antagonists to be undertaken with assistance and mediation of those parties who are trusted by the South Sudanese themselves. We believe it is important to avoid reciprocal accusatory rhetoric of the leading political forces in South Sudan. We are gravely concerned about reports about the possible use of South Sudanese territory as a staging area for support for one of the parties to the conflict in neighboring Sudan. We trust that the sovereignty of the Republic of South Sudan will not be called into question, and that the relationship between the two fraternal countries will be rooted in the spirit of both partnership and good neighborliness. This is especially necessary in light of the economic relations and interdependence between Sudan and South Sudan. We have taken note of the decision of the government of South Sudan to postpone general elections in the country to December 2026. We believe that the matter of conducting elections is a matter of domestic policy for South Sudan. We support international efforts to normalize the situation, and as well as to reinforce peace and security in the Republic of South Sudan. We pay tribute to the mediation efforts of the African Union as well as member states of IGAD. We trust that what has been put together following the extraordinary IGAD summit, I refer to the ministerial level subcommittee on South Sudan, that this body will manage to effectively facilitate stabilization of the situation on the ground. At the present complicated juncture, the United Nations mission in South Sudan continues to meaningfully contribute towards implementation of the specific provisions of the revitalized peace agreement. Let us recall the inadmissibility of any acts of force against UN peacekeepers. We emphatically condemn any acts of violence targeting blue helmets, as well as humanitarian organization representatives and civilians. We trust that the mission's leadership and the host state will, through dialogue, reach mutually acceptable solutions on the question of the UNMIS Tolming base. Thank you for your attention.
Je remercie Madame.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Representative Haysom and Director Usunu for their briefings. I have also listened attentively to the statement by Ms. Nassima. We welcome the presence of the permanent representative of South Sudan at today's meeting. Recently, the situation in South Sudan remains tense, with intensified clashes in areas such as Upper Nile State, resulting in casualties and a deteriorated humanitarian situation. In light of the SG's report, I wish to emphasize the following points. First, it is crucial to safeguard national peace and stability. We commend President Kiir's statement that the country will not go back to war. We call on all parties in South Sudan to put the overall interests of the country and people first, exercise maximum calm and restraint, and make every effort to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control and the conflict from spreading. At the same time, we urge the swift resumption of dialogue and consultations to tackle disputes and differences through peaceful means. We support the government in fulfilling its primary responsibility to protect civilians and in continuing to advance intercommunal dialogue and reconciliation to achieve peaceful coexistence. We support the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of South Sudan. Second, regional level good offices must be strengthened. We welcome IGAD and AU convening meetings and issuing communiques on the situation in South Sudan. We support the leading role of the UN, AU, IGAD trilateral mechanism in actively facilitating peace and dialogue and in prioritizing African solutions to African issues. Regional partners are doing their utmost in mediation. We call on countries with influence over the parties to play a constructive part in jointly bringing about de-escalation. It is imperative that the international community support these regional-level good offices, allow it the time and space required, and refrain from undue pressure that may exacerbate tensions. Third, external assistance needs to be increased. China commends the government for its coordination with the UN agencies in providing assistance to the over 1 million refugees and returnees flowing in from Sudan, and for taking proactive measures to ensure the safety of of Sudanese nationals within its borders. As the rainy season approaches, the risks of widespread flooding, disease outbreaks, and food shortage may further worsen the humanitarian situation on the ground. The international community should increase rather than decrease its assistance to jointly support the response to these humanitarian challenges. Fourth, it is essential to support UNMIS in its mandate fulfillment. We strongly condemn the attacks against UNMIS personnel and reiterate that no attacks targeting peacekeepers are acceptable. We urge all parties to ensure the safety and security of UNMIS camps and personnel. The Council will soon discuss the renewal of UNMIS mandate this month. As a major troop contributing country to the mission, China will constructively participate in consultations and support the mission in better fulfilling its mandated responsibilities. President, since the signing of the revitalized agreement in 2018, South Sudan has been striving to overcome internal and external challenges, steadily advancing the peace process. While the process has been fraught with challenges, all parties have been committed to implementing the agreement as a shared objective, achieving a great deal of tangible progress on the ground. These achievements have not come by easily and deserve to be cherished all the more by all of us. The current state of the revitalized agreement is regrettable. China calls on all parties in South Sudan to strengthen unity and mutual trust, cease hostilities, accelerate implementation of all provisions of the agreement, and stay on the right track towards political transition. We stand ready to continue providing support for peace and stability in South Sudan alongside the international community. The overall security landscape in the Horn of Africa is concerning, with multiple hotspot issues intertwined, generating negative spillover effects that threaten regional peace and stability. We support the Council in closely monitoring the developments on the ground, playing a constructive part and earnestly fulfilling its vital responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, I thank the SRSG Haysom, Director Orsno, and Executive Director Nasiwa for their comprehensive but sobering briefings. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of the South Sudan to this meeting. Since South Sudan's independence in 2011, despite multiple setbacks, including the civil wars of the 2013 and 2016, the forced extension of the transitional period in September 2024, regional and international actors have continued to serve as guarantors of revitalized agreement. However, the recent surge in violence threatens to reverse the hard-won progress made since 2018 agreement, and it could push the country back into full-side civil war. In this context, I'd like to highlight the 4 points. First, we urge all parties to immediately cease hostilities and engage constructive, direct dialogue. Ongoing violence, including aerial bombardments affecting civilian areas, along with the detention of the Vice President Machar, are deeply concerning. These acts of violence jeopardize the revitalized agreement and may constitute the violation of the Security Council Resolution 2729, which urges the party to implement the permanent ceasefire. In this regard, it is imperative that Security Council issue a resolute and united message to address the deteriorating situation that undermines the spirit of the revitalized agreement. Second, we call on the host government to respect the UNMIS's freedom of movement based on the status of the forces agreements, given the deteriorating security situation. We condemn in the strongest terms the attack against the UNMIS personnel and assets, and reiterate all parties to guarantee the safety and security of the UN peacekeepers at all times. In addition, the host nation must engage in full and timely consultation with the UNMIS on all operational matters, including Tonkin Base. As a troop contributing country, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its full support for UNMIS. Third, regional actors must recommit to their role as peace guarantors, as they did in previous mediation efforts that helped end civil war. To prevent further instability, stemming from the spillover of the Sudan conflict, we urge both Sudanese warring parties to refrain from actions that may escalate the tension in South Sudan. In addition, we are particularly alarmed by foreign presence and intervention in South Sudan. Their growing partisan roles heighten the risk of a regional escalation. In this regard, we welcome the engagement of the African Union, IGAD, and other regional partners through high-level meetings and mediation. We urge South Sudan to respond constructively to these initiatives. First, escalating violence worsens the already dire humanitarian crisis and underscores the urgency of civilian protection, particularly for women and girls. The rise in violence also exacerbates the threat of conflict-related sexual violence and recruitment of or abduction of the children for combat. We draw attention to joint statement WPS this morning and urge all parties to implement its recommendations. We call for stronger international support for humanitarian efforts. For our part, Republic of Korea is partnering with the UNDP, UNFPA, and WFP to promote peace building, assist the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and enhance food security in climate-vulnerable communities under our conflict-affected and fragile countries supporting program. Mr. President, Secretary Guterres recently depicted the situation in South Sudan as darkly reminiscent of the past civil wars. South Sudan's leaders must reject violence and recommit to the spirit of the revitalized agreement. I conclude by recalling one line from its preamble of revitalized agreement. I quote, "determined not to repeat mistakes of the past," I unquote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the delegations of Slovenia and Guyana in our capacity as informal co-focal points on conflict and hunger in the Security Council. I thank SRSG Haysom, Director Wosurnu, and Ms. Nasiwa for their briefings and welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of South Sudan in this meeting. Colleagues, South Sudan is experiencing a convergence of crises. The recent escalation of political tensions and violence, the fragility of the peace agreement, decreased humanitarian funding, relentless climate shocks, an economic recession, a persistent health catastrophe, and growing food insecurity. Guyana and Slovenia are deeply concerned about the impact of these challenges on civilians, particularly for the most food insecure. According to the latest IPC report on South Sudan, issued in November 2024, an estimated 7.7 million South Sudanese, or 57% of the population, will be severely food insecure between April and July 2025. Refugees and returnees fleeing the war in Sudan are at particular risk, since about 31,000 returnees are at risk of famine. We are deeply disturbed by the recent surge of violence, particularly in regions such as Upper Nile State, Western Equatoria, and Great Bahar el Ghazal regions. Mr. President, these developments in South Sudan come on the heels of several pre-existing challenges, including, inter alia, the cholera outbreak plaguing the country since October 2024, and climate-induced shocks that frequently result in region-wide floods, such as that which devastated agricultural lands in Jonglei State. Limited food supplies are also a source of tension, reinforcing the relationship between food insecurity and conflict. Active conflict is further hampering humanitarian operations, with food distribution being currently put on hold in 6 states due to insecurity, deepening operational challenges in an environment already seen as one of the most dangerous for humanitarian workers. Against this backdrop, Guyana and Slovenia underscore the following points. 1. International humanitarian law mandates the protection of objects indispensable to civilian survival, including foodstuffs, agriculture areas, crops, and livestock. IHL further limits actions that could impede access to food, such as attacks on food supplies or agricultural areas. These measures were further reinforced by this very Council in Resolution 2417. We call on all parties to adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, ensure protection of civilians, and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access. 2. The complexity of challenges in South Sudan requires a comprehensive conflict, climate, and gender-sensitive response that encompasses building resilience, targeted aid, capacity building, addressing obstruction challenges, and safe passage for humanitarian workers. Special emphasis is placed on the need for measures to respect and protect humanitarian and United Nations personnel working in South Sudan. 3. Special attention must be given to those who are too often disproportionately affected by conflict, including women, children, and displaced persons. Protection risks related to negative coping mechanisms and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence must be taken into account. Measures must be put in place to protect the most vulnerable, particularly in advance of the lean season, where the situation is likely to deteriorate without targeted intervention. A unified voice of the Council remains critical in this regard. I conclude, Mr. President, by reaffirming Guyana and Slovenia's unwavering commitment to dialogue, de-escalation, and lasting peace in South Sudan, one in which the full democratic aspirations of its people are realized, including through a peaceful, transparent, and inclusive electoral process. This foundation is a critical step in overcoming the country's humanitarian and development challenges, including food insecurity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement. As focal point for the group on putting an end to conflict, I now will make a statement as representative of France. First of all, I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Haysom, the Director of OCHA, Ms. Wosornu, and Ms. Jacqueline Nasiwa from the Center for Governance, Peace and Justice for their briefings, and I welcome the representative of South Sudan to this meeting. South Sudan is at a critical juncture. We need to be vigilant and responsible. We have heard how concerned the briefers are about the situation. Intercommunity violence has got worse, particularly in the Upper Nile region. Many people have died. We have seen airstrikes on civilian areas. This has had serious consequences for civilians, notably women and children and displaced people. We are seeing an uptick in sexual violence. We must avoid the situation getting any worse, and France joins the appeals to de-escalation and dialogue. Parties must go back to the revitalized peace agreement and commit to respecting it. Peace in South Sudan is fragile. It was only reached after years of brutal civil war. The unilateral measures that contravene the agreement are concerning, notably the house arrest of the former vice president. We support the call of the African Union for him to be released. France stresses in particular the need for progress in the revitalization of the agreement, the deployment of the necessary forces, and the drafting of a constitution in the context of an inclusive process that gives full place to women in the future of the country. There have to be free and transparent elections. The authorities must go back to the spirit of dialogue and commitment in the interest of the people. We also call on all states to refrain from any action that would stoke tensions and could lead to the conflict spilling over. This is a serious threat to regional stability. Respect for the arms embargo and collective action to promote inclusive dialogue for the people of South Sudan is critical. The Council must therefore shoulder its responsibilities in this context. We support the idea of a Security Council resolution on the situation in South Sudan, regardless and separate from the issue of the renewal of the mandate. If we can speak with one voice, we can say that the parties must stick to the agreement and respect international humanitarian law and support regional efforts in this context as well. Against this difficult backdrop, France expresses its full support to UNMIS and Mr. Haysom as well. We strongly condemn attacks on the mission's personnel, and attacks on soldiers are war crimes. UNMIS and the South Sudanese authorities must continue to work together to fulfill the mandate and in the respecting the agreement on the SOFA agreement. The international community must remain mobilized to support the people of South Sudan. We have seen that there are considerable needs, and in spite of how many crises there are, we must not overlook the plight of the people of Southern Sudan. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, good morning, members of the Council. And I take this opportunity to congratulate you for your presidency of the Security Council for the month of April, and I assure you of our delegation full support and cooperation. I would like also to acknowledge and appreciate the presence of Mr. Nicholas Haysom and Ms. Adim, and Jacqueline Nasiwa, and I appreciate your comprehensive reports equally. At the outset, we would like to wish and express our deepest condolences and unequivocal condemnation of the heinous attack on the UNMIS helicopter in Nasser on March 7th, which claimed the lives of humanitarians and UNMIS personnel. We extend our deepest condolences to the families and pledge a full and impartial investigation to hold those responsible accountable. It is also worth noting that the government has already launched this investigation and is committed to bringing those responsible to justice and ensuring that safety and security of all United Nations personnel operating in the country. It is also worth noting that during this crisis of March 7th, not only have soldiers of the South Sudan Defense Forces lost their lives, also some of their family members were killed along with them, wives and children. And this is an act that must be brought to books, and the government will do all of its work to make sure that this is brought forth. Mr. President, as a sovereign nation striving for peace and stability, we remain committed to transparency, accountability, and cooperation with all stakeholders who support our nation's progress. The government of South Sudan remains steadfast in its commitment to the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. Despite the challenges, we are moving forward. However, we recognize that the current political situation in the country has raised concern among our international partners and regional partners. We are grateful to the African Union for its support, in particular the recent visit of Mr. Raila Odinga on behalf of President William Ruto of Kenya, the panel of WISE on behalf of the African Union, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, Eritrea Presidential Envoy, and the European delegation, whose engagement reaffirms the continent and the international community's commitment to the peace process in South Sudan. We also wish to inform the Council that IGAD is scheduled to visit South Sudan in the time of their convenience. The government is working tirelessly with the partners to ensure that the implementation of the peace process continues and progress to a manner that inclusive, transparent, and credibility are met. Mr. President, the voice of the people of South Sudan remain clear and unwavering. We are calling for peace from every corner of our nation. Citizens are urging their leaders to uphold and protect the gains made since the signing of the peace agreement. The government hears their voices and reaffirms our collective duty to ensure that this peace is not only preserved but also strengthened. As the Security Council considers the mandate of UNMIS, we request that the mission continue to work in close partnership with our national institutions aligns its efforts with evolving realities on the ground and support the transition from peacekeeping to peace building. We acknowledge the observation presented in the April 2025 assessment by the Secretary General and the provision highlighted by the African Union, IGAD, and UNMIS. These institutions have stood beside us since our independence and remain grateful to their partnership in our journey to peace and democratic future. We recognize the importance of conditions identified for peaceful and credible elections. The government welcomes the finalization of the election-specific timelines by the National Election Commission and reiterate the determination to hold inclusive and credible elections at the end of the transition period. While challenges remain, particularly in launching civic education and constitutional consultations, we are taking concrete steps to advance the critical milestones with urgency and seriousness. Mr. President, I stand before you today to address the recent development and the ongoing implementation of the Revitalized Peace Agreement and the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. The government of South Sudan has taken note of the concerns raised by the UN Secretary General, the African Union Peace and Security Council, the IGAD, and other regional and international partners regarding the current security and political situation in our country. First, let me reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the full and faithful implementation of the Revitalized Peace Agreement. We are mindful of our duty to safeguard the gains made since the signing of the agreement to ensure that South Sudan remain in the path to peace, unity, and democratic transition. We recognize the devastation impact of the localized violence and the involvement of armed youth groups, and the government is strengthening its national policing and deploying mobile courts in affected areas to ensure justice and accountability. In partnership with regional and international partners, we are investing in rule of law mechanism and enhancing national reconciliation efforts to address the roots of intercommunal strifes. At the same time, the operationalization of the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation and Healing Act of 2024 and the Compensation Reparation Act marks a historic opportunity for our nation to reckon with the past, repair the wounds of the conflict, and move forward in unity. These are not just legal frameworks. They are instruments of healing, justice, and reconciliation for our people. However, we must not ignore the shadows that looms over these gains. The arrest of Dr. Machar and several IO members, officials, has triggered fears of reversal in the peace process. However, President Salva Kiir Mayardit has assured the people of South Sudan and our partners that we must not return to war and that we must remain fully committed to the Revitalized Peace Agreement. We recognize the fragility of the moment and are working diligently to de-escalate the tensions, restore dialogue, and protect the integrity of the peace process. Our nation cannot afford to return to a conflict and welcome the calls of the African Union, IGAD, and the United Nations and the Security Council for restraints and consensual decision-making. We will not allow short-term grievances to undermine the long aspiration of our people. Beyond the political front, we are actually aware of the deep humanitarian crisis facing our people. Over 6.1 million of our citizens are at risk of acute food insecurities. The conflict in Sudan, the cholera outbreak, and the climate shocks have only worsened this situation. Women and children are always the one bearing the burden of such sufferings. We are working with urgency to facilitate humanitarian access, support vulnerable communities, and stabilize our economy, even as we grapple with resources constraints. We thank our people for their remarkable generosity in hosting more than 1.1 million refugees fleeing from Sudan crisis, and South Sudan remain committed to upholding international obligations to protect civilians, including foreign nationals, and will continue to act against retaliatory violence. South Sudan once again is at the crossroads. We can either allow discord and division to unravel, the progress we have made, or we can choose a harder, noble path to peace, unity, and reform. For the people of South Sudan, the choice is clear. We choose peace, and your continued support is greatly appreciated. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of South Sudan for her statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.